Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these heterodox conversations for complexity. Hello again, and thanks so much for tuning in as always. A few housekeeping notes, including a new event to our series of online events this spring, which we are hosting on our newly launched Thought Stretchers education community. You can find that at thoughtstretchers.org, and of course there is an events page. On February 13th, so next week, we will have an online meetup, our salon discussion, where a few of us will get together and talk about some topics to be announced. We have some interesting people who have RSVP'd for that. We'd love to have you join us. On February 25th, we are going to talk about the side effects of school and ponder the question, does traditional schooling lead to poor mental health for students? Naomi Fisher is a clinical psychologist who created quite a stir on Twitter, recently posting some things about this. And Michael Strong, who has been on the podcast recently and is the director of the Adolescent Flourishing Initiative at the University of Austin, will be joining us. So we have quite a few who have RSVP'd for this, and it promises to be a lively discussion. On March 13th, we will have Ron Richhart, who will join us as part of a book club around his book, which is The Cultures of Thinking and Action, 10 Mindsets to Transform Our Teaching and Students' Learning. And he was on the podcast recently talking about that. But if you are interested in the book and his work, which is certainly great, I would urge you to get the book and sign up and RSVP and join us for that author visit where you can ask him your questions. On March 27th, we are going to have an event on reading instruction. If you've been paying attention, reading instruction has been really a hot topic after Emily Hanford's podcast came out, Sold a Story. Emily was on a previous podcast with a panel that we did live, and this is sort of an extension of that. But this time we will have Karen Gazeth, who is an education professor and author and has a new book on the neuroscience of reading instruction. We'll also have Christy Biggerstaff, who's the director of early literacy at the Kentucky Department of Education, and Sonia Thomas, who is the CEO of a parent advocacy group in Nashville, Tennessee called Nashville Propel. So again, reading instruction, evidence, and neuroscience, and that's March 27th. On April 18th, we are going to talk about a report that was published by the Harwood Institute, and we'll have Bridget Blom from the Pritchard Committee and Rich Harwood of the Harwood Institute to discuss catalyzing community-led change, overcoming the divisive and narrow politics of our time. One of the things that this report gets at, and both of their work gets at, is the implementation of community schools, and we'll talk quite a bit about that during that event. And then last but certainly not least is an event with Kath Murdoch, who some of you might know from previous podcast appearances and her work on inquiry. And on May 11th, we'll talk with her about her new book. And this event is called A Journey Through the Landscape of Inquiry with Kath Murdoch. Again, that's May 11th. I certainly encourage you to go to thoughtstretchers.org and check out our community and engage and sign up. And of course, RSVP to join any or all of those events. Speaking of events, we have our pre-registration open for PBL Grow 24, which will be June 24th through 27th, back in Louisville, Kentucky, our hometown. You can find that on WeGrowTeachers.com, which is our main professional development site and has all of our professional development offerings. And there along the top menu, you will see an item called PBL Grow 24. You can pre-register there and save your seat for this limited seating event. We only have 40 that we will allow in. And so if you are interested in learning about project-based learning as an individual or small group, this is a great opportunity. As always, please reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org with any comments, questions, concerns, or ideas. And don't forget to share this podcast and our work if you find it valuable. In this episode, I spoke with Sofie Roux, who is currently a sophomore at Stanford University and the architect and founder of Bloombox Design Labs. As you'll hear, Sofie is a remarkable young woman, and I asked her about her upbringing and educational experience, as I thought that was an interesting piece of the puzzle in thinking about how she came to design and work on these Bloombox Design Labs and related projects. She talked a lot about design thinking, and we talked about the role of inquiry and the importance of asking questions, which of course is resonant with lots of the work that we do. I asked her about the dynamics of being young and a female operating in these spaces, trying to get some pretty big things done in the adult space. I won't say much more because certainly the conversation and her words speak for themselves. But as always, I hope it's helpful, and here's my conversation with Sofie. All right, I'm here with Sofie Roux, who is going to talk to us about some of the work and projects that she has done and is doing. Specifically, I think it's Bloombox Design Labs, but she's done some other work. She's, I believe, a sophomore at Stanford University, and kind of dive into some of her history. But I guess let's give you an opportunity here to say hello, and for folks to maybe learn a bit more about you and your long and storied career.
Well, that's a very nice way to put it. It has been an interesting 19 years. I'm Sofie. I'm very excited to be on the show today, and thank you for having me.
Okay, so tell me about, so you live in Canada. Tell me about your educational background, where you went to school, what that was like. Let's kind of get a little context here before we get into the work, as it is education specific.
Absolutely. I went to what I think is the best high school in the world. So I went to a couple different schools growing up, but I landed on an all-girls school here in Vancouver, where we didn't have a playground. We had kind of a forest, which was very interesting, and I think it changed a lot about the way I think, because we kind of were forced to imagine and explore and kind of have that be the basis for our play. And then the classroom work was intense as well. I was there from grade 4 up till grade 12, and I remember just being surrounded by girls who were great at everything. They challenged themselves to be the best, on the field and in the science lab and in the art studio, and it made me realize that the potential of young women is absolutely unlimited. And so I think that definitely shaped my worldview, even, after having left that environment. Those values will always be with me, and I remain good friends with my high school teachers now, and I actually returned to my high school last week to give a presentation, and it was just as kind of grand as I remember it, which doesn't always happen upon return to places you've grown out of. But to me, it's a great example of what a learning environment could and should be.
Well, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to pull on that thread a little bit, because that's kind of germane to a lot of the work that we do. I guess I'm curious, maybe you said grades 4 through 12, maybe in grades 4 it wasn't as much your decision, but why the switch to that school, especially being an all-girls school?
At the grade 4 level?
Yeah.
Oh, well, actually, I was sort of, I wasn't the happiest in my earlier school life. I loved school. I tried really hard, but I just wasn't fitting in for some reason. I guess, the rest of my life, I didn't fit in, in every circle either, but grade 1 was really hard, and I toughed it out in grade 2. Grade 3, I got like the best student of the year award. I had, not too many friends, so we tried something new. And I don't think it was necessarily a difference of boys and girls in the class at that age, but I did find that when it was in like an all-girls learning environment, I sort of flourished a little bit more. And I met my best friend the first day of 4th grade, who is still my best friend today. So.
Okay. And how would you characterize, because you've done a little bit, but how would you characterize the I guess sort of educational approach of the teachers. I kind of maybe have a sense from some of the adjectives you used, but would you say it was more traditional, more sort of progressive? What kind of ways would you describe that educational experience?
So my high school was kind of the schools in Vancouver. It was definitely one that was focused on preparing girls for university. Admissions to university, especially to the States from Canada, as we are international students, it's super competitive. It's super competitive everywhere. So as we got older, we had to take a lot of AP classes. I think I took 9 in grade 12. And so I guess in a sense, our teachers were limited to the curriculum that they were given to teach because it's standardized. But I did find that they brought their own sort of sense of wonder to it, and I think that definitely extended. One of my so I have a couple of favorite teachers. One ran the computer lab down like in the basement, and it was this sort of other world you'd step into. Like all your classes were pretty by the book upstairs, and then you'd come to like AP Comp Sci, and it would be like entering some kind of a cool like makers like, tech collective. Every week you'd have these big monitors, and you'd be showing like SpaceX rocket launch on like 5 different screens, and you'd feel like you were entering a different world. That was really cool for me. And then another was in grade 9. I had a science teacher who he would blow things up in class, and he would make us build roller coasters throughout the entire science lab that other teachers would get mad at us for because they were safety hazards. And he got us to do this assignment where we could ask questions about like anything we wanted in the world, and he would answer them, even if they were silly. Like someone asked, if you slapped a chicken enough times, would you be able to cook it because of kinetic energy becoming heat? And he went into detail. He took a whole 90-minute lesson to explain to us how that would happen. These kind of teachers, I guess, they never thought our questions were silly. They created worlds for us where we actually belonged, and that mattered to me. I'm still good friends with these teachers. Like I'm launching an app, and the teacher of computer science invited me to launch it in front of our whole school last week. And I went to Newfoundland, kind of the edge of the continent, to work for my 9th grade science teacher, who's now an architect. So I don't know. I think for me, those teachers and many more became sort of lifelong role models and friends to me after I graduated, which was really cool.
Well, that does sound interesting. And you've matriculated to Stanford, and you felt like you were prepared and ready to enter university academic life?
The thing about university, I think, is that it's so much more teaching you about life than just academics. My life in high school was pretty focused. I would go to school and then I would come home. I worked on the Bloombox project, hung out with my family, and kind of would run cross country in the mornings, and that was it, sort of. Then I got to Stanford, and I was suddenly like, I had to wake myself up in the morning for class. I had to get on a bike, even if it was cold in the morning, and ride to class, lock my bike, not lose my room key or my bike key. I had to make new friends. I had to, I don't know, I had to figure out my own study schedule, how to go to the gym, how to eat well. And all of that was a challenge in the first quarter, for sure. I felt disoriented. I missed my mom. It was hard, but I think academically I was definitely prepared. Life-wise, it was an exponential learning curve, and I got there by the end of the year. My birthday always falls, at the end of the school year in June, and I started the school year not knowing if I'd have a happy ending, but on my birthday, my friends and I rode our bikes across the Golden Gate Bridge, and it was one of the best days of my life. And I realized that, that in itself was a huge win, was like having friends that went through something hard. And I think sometimes just treating people with kindness, and sticking up for your friends, and taking care of yourself can be a huge win as well. That's equally important to any other significant stride.
Yeah. Well, one of the things is, as we were talking before we started recording, I have 2 daughters, and younger than you, but not too far behind. And one of the things I try to help them understand, that you're sort of articulating well, is that they can do hard things. And when you do hard things and actually do them, and even if you fail at them, you have learned quite a bit. And there's a real value to that process. How old are you at this point?
I'm 19.
19, okay. And your parents, you mentioned your mom. What's their sort of background and sort of educationally and professionally? What do they do?
Absolutely. Well, first, I love what you said about girls doing hard things. I think they absolutely can. I think ages 14 and 16 are hard because I think it's really easy to lose your sense of self at that time, when the world is sort of becoming very real, and you're finding your place in it. And I think it's really easy to say now, but staying true to yourself in those years is the most important thing in the world. My parents are physicians. They are from Alberta, and they went to medical school there, and then they did they went to Harvard School of Public Health after undergrad, and then went on to pursue very brilliant and worldly careers. And I'm so proud to be their daughter. My mom is a sports medicine physician. My dad is a trauma surgeon, and both of them just live their lives with a sense of relentless pursuit of excellence and truth and beauty. And also they've been very involved in helping me grow up. I think that's really beautiful. They, put 100% into their own careers, but it also feels like they're putting 110 into helping me realize mine. So I am very grateful for their roles in my life. And it was hard to be away from them. I feel like I did lose myself a little bit, but I got back on track, and I think I'm stronger because of it, for sure.
Well, you mentioned an app, and I want to hear about that. One question that popped in my head as you're talking about, and thinking about my daughters and how you find yourself and lose yourself and those kinds of things, is the role of technology. And I'm quite a bit longer in the tooth than you, and technology at your age, when I was your age, was obviously much different. So I'm curious what your thoughts are, and maybe how you describe your relationship with technology and phones and maybe social media, because I have so many wonders and concerns about how much time my daughters and other kids spend staring at screens and little screens. And then, of course, there's the social media effects that are part of that, but not the only part of that. So how would you describe your relationship with those kinds of devices and tech?
Well, I think that technology is so exciting. I think the ways that we can use it to do good are vastly just miraculous to me. I think that it's important that we are technologically literate, and most of all that we get as many people on the planet technologically literate as possible. I think that when you have a cell phone in your hands, like kind of anything is possible. And so a big part of my company, Bloombox Design Labs, is making sure that people around the world are connected to technology and eventually connected to the internet, because I think that unleashes a lot of human potential. On a personal level, it's definitely hard to grow up with the influences of social media. I find myself, comparing myself to others all the time, and I don't think it's healthy. I think the way that we're able to access information about our friends all the time can be hard. It can make us jealous or feel lonely, and that's not great at all. But I think it can also make us feel more connected and loved. So I think finding some kind of a balance is really important. I took a gap quarter from Stanford this quarter, so just from September to January, and it's been really nice to be able to stay connected with my friends, for sure. But I also definitely realized that it takes up a lot of our time, and it takes up a lot of our capacity in our brains that could be focused on other things. So I don't know what the right answer is. I think that we're heading in kind of a scary direction with AI and everything, because it's a little unknown to me. But here's one thing: I think that technology will always be guided by human values, because it's not inherently creative. It's a learning software. So I think if we're able to approach it in a values-based way on a personal level and on a global level, I think that would be the best possible way to move forward.
Did your parents place limitations or sort of boundaries and restrictions on your use of technology and like smartphones and things like that?
No, they didn't. No.
Okay. Well, interesting. So let's get into the meat of Bloombox Design Labs. And I know that you, or if I'm correct, it's not your first venture. You had, I think it was called Sparkly and Smart. So maybe you can talk a bit about that. But what is Bloombox Design Labs, and how did you get there? And so what's the genesis of all of that?
Absolutely. Well, Bloombox Design Labs is my public benefit company focused on taking a design thinking approach to bringing high quality education to students around the world. I started it in high school when I designed and built a solar powered computer lab in a repurposed shipping container in my backyard here in Vancouver, and shipped it across the world to Malawi, where we built it out at a high school there. And it's been running for the past 3 years. And now we've moved production to Southern Africa, and we have teams between South Africa and Malawi that build out these labs, and we install them. We put one in a rural setting, and so we redesigned the roof system to make it retractable and secure and transportable. And we put the third next generation design in Dzaleka refugee camp in northern Malawi, where it serves a population reliant on digital degrees because they cannot attend public universities in a country that is not their own for free. And now we have exciting new steps coming up in terms of creating a North American assembly line in order to sell Bloombox roofs commercially and use the revenue to fuel at-cost installations in Africa, as well as to expand our reach by partnering with the government of Malawi to scale this initiative to 70 labs in the next 3 years. And finally, launching the Super Bloom Global Knowledge Network app, which is currently in development and which is launching in March 2024, which will connect students at Bloomboxes and to students around the world in high school, where they can ask questions in 1-minute video formats, and then from there have their questions responded to with resources from university students. And this will all be supported by Starlink Internet, which is going to be installed at all current Bloomboxes this winter and all future Bloomboxes to come.
Well, that's quite an elevator pitch there. Sounds like you've maybe said it a few times. So when did this idea start to germinate, and why? How did it become such a passion?
Yeah, well, this is an education podcast, so it's the perfect place to speak about the origin story. I guess for me, as I said, I love school. I got to grow up in girls' learning environments. And also I got to visit Africa many times since I was little. My parents had some work at one of the trauma bays in Cape Town. So I grew up going to Cape Town. And when I was 5, the first time I went, I was 9 months old, and we went every year. And then when I was 5, we visited a township. And I sort of realized that there's a staggering difference in the resources students had in classroom settings there compared to where I was going to school. I don't think I would have used the word staggering at the time as a but it did just sort of like pull at my heart in a way I hadn't experienced before. And so I started making craft crafts and bake sale items and selling them at kindergarten, and then deposited the money at the bank, sold it outside the bank. And we raised $5,000, which I brought back the next year to Kailicha Township, to Rosie Mishale, who is the leader of Bafumalele Children's Home. And she asked me what I wanted to do with the money, which was interesting because, I was 6 at the time, and I had never been asked a question like that before. But, she trusted my judgment. She said, you raised the money. What do you want to do with it? I told her I loved school, and we raised money for a couple computers. And that's kind of where my journey began, because I realized that you're not too little to start. And so everything moving forward was based on that value of an appreciation of girls' education, and how can we be eliminating barriers between girls and the best possible school experience. And so as I got older, I learned about the water crisis and how girls are carrying water instead of going to school. So I started selling my art, which was kind of progressing into becoming watercolor designs. And my mom helped me get them printed on like notebooks and tea towels. And then I sold at craft fairs around the city, and I raised enough for 3 water wells and a sanitary pad making machine. And then I got to visit Malawi, to the site of the water wells, which was sort of unheard of. Most people do not go visit, but I really wanted to see it for myself. So we convinced Kurt Dahlen, the founder of Water Wells for Africa. And that was in the 9th grade. And I remember, so I guess that's Sparkly and Smart. That's my social enterprise, which was an art company where I would sell art at craft sales. And I was able to raise $300,000 through that initiative. And then, anyways, I found myself in Malawi, in Blantyre, which is one of the big cities in Malawi, at a high school, watching students kind of come in and out of classes as I painted a mural there. And just kind of, I was in conversation with them and hearing about their aspirations. And I realized like it was another one of these wow moments where these students are brilliant, they're interesting, they're driven, and there's no electricity at their school, there's no running water. How can I help? I took an architecture course that summer, and then raised money through selling my art again, to buy a shipping container, because I thought anything that I would build here would have to be shipped to Malawi. And then using the structure of that container as the structure of potentially a learning lab with electricity, was kind of the birth of Bloombox. And I had considered like just raising money for solar panels and sending them over, or raising money for computers and sending them over. But more than anything, I wanted them to have a space, like a space where they would come and feel welcome and feel ready to learn, kind of the way that space has opened up for me at my high school. So that's the birth of Bloombox Design Labs. And because, it all started with a design thinking approach, that is an iterative process where you keep making the design better and better after learning from student experience. The design has evolved, we've grown, we've gone internationally, we've brought it back to North America, and I'm very excited to see where it leads. And I think more than it being just, a box, a Bloom box, I think it's a concept. And so I think the design could change drastically in the next decade, but I think that the values will stay the same.
Okay, and what do you study at Stanford right now?
So I'm studying sustainable architecture and engineering, in the School of Engineering, and also minoring in Russian.
In Russian, okay. And where did you learn the design thinking process?
So I learned it, let's see. I learned about it when I was writing a speech, which was sort of after building the first Bloom box. And I was sort of blown away because I realized that we had followed the design thinking cycle without knowing about it. So I think it goes empathize, ideate, prototype, test, and iterate. I may have missed one there, but the main idea is that, you find a problem that you just can't stop thinking about, and you try to build a solution to it. You test your solution on people, you listen to feedback, and you make it better. Um, and I think that's a beautiful concept. I mean, my family, it's sort of a family of makers. This is odd. I guess that's an odd thing to say, but my family is really good at making things, especially my grandma. She's been a collector of beautiful things that, or I guess ordinary things that could become beautiful things most of her life. She's Russian, but she grew up in Shanghai and Brazil and San Francisco, and kind of from each of these places, she collected simple things with a vision for what they could be. And she sort of taught me about how you can make something ordinary into something extraordinary. And that's kind of the values behind Bloombox as well. Is like, it's just a shipping container, it's just computers, but when you kind of design with the intent of making it a place for kids to belong and for kids to explore, it becomes something extraordinary. So I guess I've lived my life informed by the design thinking process, which is basically just like designing thoughtfully. And now I have a label for it too.
And you mentioned, I think you said your grandmother is or was Russian, and is that why you're studying Russian, or are there other ulterior motives?
No ulterior motives. My grandma and grandpa are Russian. I think it's a cool language. I grew up like also taking Russian lessons, mostly because I wanted to speak to my grandma she speaks English, but to be able to speak to her in Russian as well would have been cool. And I went to a Russian class with Lyudmila Viktorovna, who lives here in Vancouver, on a street that is, it's townhouses. It's a street of just townhouses, but so you drive down the street, and every house is exactly the same, and you stop at hers, and the garden is filled with like wind turbines and just like ladybugs and frogs and sculptures and fountains. And I don't know, for me it was like an escape from sort of like the mundane nights of winter here in Vancouver. I would get to escape into this like dream world with like beautiful old Russian music playing on the on record players, and she would her house was filled with treasures that I had never seen around the city before. So it became magic for me. It became magic to translate stories, to understand them in their original language. Russia is extremely complex, and right now, I think most Russians that I know are absolutely devastated, with what's going on. But I still think that there's beauty in the language and the literature, and I think it's exciting to learn about it.
Well, one of the things that is true about the design thinking process is that I think it leans pretty heavily into the inquiry process. And one of the things that we talk about a lot here, or at least I talk about and think a lot about, is the ways in which teachers teach and students learn and people learn. And the pieces of that, and part of the reason I asked you about your high school experience was to sort of unpack and kind of get at some of that, because there are sort of ways in which people think about education being very traditional, like lots of lecture, or what somebody would say direct and explicit instruction, which isn't necessarily, it's not lecture, it's many other things if it's done well. And then sort of on the other end of it being a more progressive or inquiry-centered educational approach. And I happen to think that both are very important, but neither is sufficient. Like, we need all of those kinds of things. So I'm curious how you think about, or any further reflections you might have in your educational process, and maybe sort of extending that, like when you engage in this work and the iterations and all of the things that you have to do to make these things successful, because there's lots of failures along the way, that what is the role of inquiry? What has that been, and how do you think about, and maybe even explicit processes that you've engaged in that might be sort of inquiry centered?
Very interesting question. I think you're right. I think the role of an educator is extremely complex, and there's no set of like one approach that would be complete enough to educate a child. I don't know anything about design of curriculum in that sense, but I do know how to ask questions, and that's exactly what you were touching on. So what we do at our labs is every month we conduct a survey about teacher, student and leadership experience to learn from what they like about the labs, what could be better, what could be different. Everything we do is based on sort of this rigorous analysis of data. And part of that is through our server. So currently all Bloom boxes have 20 laptop computers that are connected to an off-grid server. And this server gets constantly updated remotely based on student inquiry. So part of the survey is asking, like, what do students want to learn more about? What are they interested in? And then those specific resources are able to be uploaded to this intranet so students can access them. So it's constantly being updated based on student needs. And another way we can anticipate sort of what students are interested in will be through this app, Super Bloom, with the hope that we're able to better understand local curriculum, student needs, and teacher needs, and sort of supplement it in the best way possible.
So you say you know how to ask questions, which I think is one of the most important things that we can have as a sort of outcome for students. There's lots of other things. That's not the only thing, but the ways in which we teach, I think we really want to make sure that students are coming out as adults knowing how to ask the important questions. So that begs the question, if you could identify, and maybe you can't, maybe it's just a sort of, this is the water in which you were swimming, or some versions of that, but where did you learn how to ask good questions?
Whoa. Well, I think growing up, I would ask questions, but the lucky thing is that I didn't get shut down too often, especially at my home. I think I was talked to like a normal person, even though I was a little kid. So I never felt that asking questions was wrong. So anyways, I would ask a lot of questions. And then when I would get to a problem, like when I was 5, my parents told me that, I found this problem where kids there had less resources than students here. So I would ask a lot of questions about it, but I felt like for that question, like, why is that happening? There was no clear answer. And the point is that, even now there is no clear answer. 14 years later, there's still no reason for that to happen because it's simply an injustice. So I think I learned to ask questions because I learned that it was the right thing to do. And I was never held back from doing that. And then I also learned that when you hit a question with no obvious answer or solution, that's when it's time to ask more questions and to go even deeper. And so I followed that sort of my whole life.
Yeah, so it sounds like probably maybe a mix of teachers and the way that they were working with you, and then certainly your parents probably fostered that in large part. One of the things that I'm certain of, and maybe you can dispel this, is that you've hit not only logistical and design roadblocks along the way, but for a number of reasons. One being your age, one being that you're female, there's some others along the way as well that people have either not taken you seriously or patronized, or I don't know. You I'm sure can characterize those kinds of things. I'm curious what you've run into, and if you have any sort of insight on others who might be experiencing those kinds of things.
Absolutely. Well, I think that first of all, I think that being young, while it is sometimes frustrating because you don't have the same kind of experience as other people, I think it can be a superpower because I think that you have unbridled energy and can ask the big questions and can be ready to learn from everyone around you. And then being a young woman specifically, as I am entering these fields of architecture and engineering and manufacturing and global supply chain, these are pretty male-dominated industries. There's a couple things that have helped me so far. One is to have a very clear why. When I tell my story, when I talk about girls' education, people are always ready to come on board. Well, not always, but the right people are ready. A lot of the times it can be sort of a magical thing. Like there was this one time when we weren't, it was the first Bloom box, and we were trying to ship 20-foot container filled with $100,000 worth of classroom supplies across the world. And we'd gotten it from Vancouver to Hong Kong to Singapore to Madagascar to Mozambique and driven it to Malawi, right? And it was just crossing the Malawian border, and the customs officials had stopped it. And they said, we can't let this go through. You got to turn it around. We can't let $100,000 worth of, whatever's in there come into our country. And so we went to this, the Ministry of Homeland Security, which is kind of one of the fanciest buildings in the city of Blantyre. And I was marched upstairs by armed guards, and I had to enter this room. And there was a guard standing there, and he said, I'm sorry, but you have to turn this around. And he was very serious.
And how old were you at this point?
I was 15.
And your parents were back in Vancouver?
My parents had come, actually,
okay.
which was so anyways, I was up there, and he said, he looked around the room and he said, who's in charge here? Who did this? And it was kind of cute because my team members are, mostly male, technicians, and they sort of shuffled out of the way, and I stepped forward and I said, I am, sir. And he said, okay, why did you do this? What are you doing here? And I told him, I said, girls' education is the most important thing I can think of. And your girls are the future of your country. And he was a hardened man. And he sort of took a couple minutes to think while I was speaking. And he said, you know what? I have a daughter, and she's 13, and she wants to be a chemist. Can you do this at my daughter's school too? And it was sort of a very interesting and unique moment that I don't think would have happened unless, I was a girl, and unless he didn't believe, and unless he, believed, if he didn't believe in the power of girls, that wouldn't have happened. So as much as I do face challenges, as much as I do not know everything, I think, being young, being a woman can be a superpower. So I try to harness that as much as I can. But I do find myself feeling frustrated at times. For example, I think there's a weird time right now for being a young founder, because you're sort of expected to know a lot, to be able to go deep into certain areas, while also being really young. I've only gone to college for a year. It was all prerequisite classes, and so I'm not necessarily a technical expert as much as a manufacturer of parts is, and I have to be speaking with them on their level and meet them where they're at. And so it does take just a lot of it takes courage. It takes trying to believe in myself unwaveringly, even when I constantly doubt myself, and just being grounded enough to know what I don't know, and to be ready to learn. So I try to take that approach that I won't always know everything, but I will be able to keep learning.
Well, again, when I think about empowering my daughters and how to do that, one of the things that I think is absolutely essential is that they're comfortable in their own skins, and that they have that humility that you're talking about. Like, I don't know everything, but that's okay. Nobody knows everything. That sort of self-doubt that you mentioned, that I think at least my intuition is that that's perhaps a bit more prevalent among girls and women for perhaps a variety of reasons. I don't know, maybe you disagree with that, but that it shouldn't be. And so how do we help not just young girls, but women in general, and really all people? I mean, that self-doubt is present certainly in males and young and old. Do you, I imagine not only professionally in these kinds of things here, but, you are a smart, quote unquote, smart girl, right? I don't know if you get that label, but it strikes me as the work that you're doing and the things that you're doing and the way that you talk about your work is a bit unusual. And I'm wondering how your peers respond, and, are people intimidated? I would imagine you have young male suitors, and that could be pretty intimidating, right? So how do you feel like when you're sort of operating in those spaces? You get that sense?
That's a cool question. Don't usually get those kind of questions on interviews like this. Well, a couple things. As I said, I had a best friend that I met first day of grade 4, and she was sort of in my corner all the way along, because she is. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I cut out there?
No, you're
Anyways,
good.
as I was saying. So she's interested in drama and the arts, and she's a phenomenal young actress. But because our stuff was pretty different, we pursued them at the highest possible level in parallel, and we're there for each other. So that was really special. Sometimes we would compete, when we took the same classes or when we raced on the same track team, but we always made each other better. So that was a really special relationship for me. But yeah, I mean, in high school, I was working on building a bloom box in my backyard, and most of my friends didn't know about it. When I got into Stanford, a lot of my friends outside of school were really excited, but a lot of my peers in high school were, quiet. And then, so an interesting thing happened when I got to Stanford, is that I got to meet kids who didn't necessarily fit in where they're from, but who were excellent at something. And so it was sort of beautiful to be welcomed into a community of people who were a little bit like me, who were very focused on something, and who, I don't know, I had never experienced that kind of overwhelming sense of, just support with no, it didn't feel like my win is their loss, if you know what I mean, where I felt that in the past. But all along the way, I've been blessed to meet really wonderful people. And then in terms of male suitors, I guess...
or female, perhaps, who knows?
No. I think, it takes... well, I don't know. I think they do have to be a little bit brave at times. But I really like when I'm able to talk to someone and truly, learn from them. And I've... been lucky to find that a couple times. I think part of college, though, is getting your heart broken and having it be really messy, and that's definitely a part of life that I hadn't had much experience with, which contributed to my sort of messy first semester last year with the boys that way. But yeah, I definitely understand better what I want and what I deserve, and so I think as we all are growing up, and I think boys sometimes take a couple years extra to get there, I think everything will work out somehow. And that's one of the things of life, is figuring stuff out.
I'm 54. I'm still trying to work some of those things out, so maybe delayed. But no, I and I don't want to try to unpack your personal life, because that's not what we're here for, but I can just really imagine, I mean, I've experienced this as well, women who are smart and capable and don't get that same treatment or the expectation. I mean, there's a reason why there's mansplaining as a term, right? And there are many, I think, men and young men certainly who I can imagine would be intimidated by someone like yourself who, has real things going on and lots of things going on. One of the things that I'm curious about is how would you describe your sort of strongest characteristics, especially in the context of these projects like Bloombox and Super Bloom Global Knowledge Network, and then what are you not so good at?
Great question. Wait, quickly, I want to say why I called it Super Bloom. Super blooms happen when, like, after a long period of drought, rain falls, and then the earth erupts in wildflowers. So we're trying to, like, this app is like a simple resource, kind of like rain, that will allow for that explosive potential. Okay, back to your question. Something I think I'm good at is having a clear why, having a clear purpose, being able to bring people together based on a common vision, and then also to, like, just put in sort of like hard work. Like for me, especially in high school and in the academic settings, things didn't always like come easy to me right away, but I would just put in like hours and hours of grunt work. It would really frustrate me, like meeting kids who it just clicked for. But I can work hard, and I think that can be sometimes a good thing. Putting in hours, and it's really easy to do that when it's your company or your vision. I mean, not really easy, but
it doesn't feel like work the same way it does if it's not something you're committed to.
Exactly. So I think those are my couple of strengths that way, and also just really listening to people and liking, getting to know the people on my team. I think it makes it a good environment. Things I'm not so good at. I take a lot of failures. Well, I take failures very personally, which cannot be ideal sometimes. For example, this past few months, so I launched Bloombox Design Labs, though I've been working on it for a few years now as a company this September. And as you know, because you're doing a similar thing, it comes with just applying for lots of grants, putting your name out there, writing about your work, and also with what I'm doing, I have to apply, or not apply, but I have to pitch to investors often. And what'll happen is, 9 times out of 10, or I guess, 19 times out of 20, doors will shut in your face. And that's hard, especially when it's your own project, when it's something that's so deeply personal to you, and you don't get something. I've been really lucky in the past couple months to get most things that I had hoped for, because we worked really hard on them. But when I don't get something, it sort of destroys me, at least for a couple hours. And so I'm working on that. I'm working on having a little bit of a thicker skin, but I just care about what I'm doing so much and the people affected by it, that sometimes, and I don't think that's good leadership. I think good leadership is just brushing it off and keeping going. So I think that comes with maturity.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if I would agree with you that it's not good leadership necessarily. I mean, there's, I think, some real value in having, you've got a big personal stake in that, right? And so just like somebody who's an elite athlete, you lose a game and you sort of, it forces you to reflect, right? It forces you to push yourself in a way that if you weren't reacting that way, obviously if you're wallowing in it for a longer time than is productive and like literally productive, then it's a problem. But if you're not doing that, it would seem like, well, you're not actually then motivated to push yourself forward and push that project forward. So the Bloombox classrooms are physical spaces, right? You're creating these physical spaces where in places they don't have those physical spaces. The Super Bloom Global Knowledge Network is a bit different because it's providing sort of a service, right? Sort of the idea is to, I don't want to make it's certainly not the same thing as I'm understanding it, but something like the Khan Academy, like there's videos there, some content that people can access. So it's something like that, right? And so how do you, what's the process there? You've got to find people to create these responses, make sure that there's some accuracy, I suppose. If they're providing answers, we want accurate answers. How do you find those people? How are you paying for it? What's that look like?
Awesome. Yes, so it's a little bit like Khan Academy, but it's different because it's student guided. So it's a bit more like sort of maybe I don't use TikTok, but it's sort of a TikTok for education where students are creating the content and asking questions. That way it's fully guided by what they're interested in. And so we're not imposing, an outside curriculum on students, internationally.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of funding, building an app is really expensive, but I recently received seed funding. So I got an initial investment of $150,000 from an investor in the tech sphere. So I'm using part of that. There was a question in my mind of, should I build 3 more Bloom boxes, or should I work on making a couple of efforts that would allow us to expand sustainably? So that's what I'm doing. We're building this app. Development time takes about 4 months, and then also expanding to North American manufacturing market. So, and then 1 more Bloom box, but this will be a high-profile one at a government location. So those are the 3 things I'm doing, and that is the funding right now. But hopefully, I'm using this money to make more money. I've been reading business books, and I think that's what you're supposed to do. So I hope that if I put in, the money to build a first article Bloom box roof in Anaheim, that's where my manufacturer is, then we'll be able to turn a profit after making 10 or 15 of these roofs and selling them for off-grid applications.
Gotcha.
That's my goal. Yep.
And what's the reason, or what do you hope to gain from talking with people like myself?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to have met you. I love podcasts. I think they're really cool. Well, I didn't love them because I didn't know about them. But then my dad put me on to Lex Friedman. And I thought he's great. He's stoic, it's a philosophy I think is cool.
He has some Russian background too, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does.
Yeah.
I love his insightful questions. So I've only been on a couple podcasts so far, but I just like the concept of speaking with people about topics that matter, and I think it's a real honor that you'd be willing to listen to what a 19-year-old kid has to say. But ultimately, I hope to get the word out about Bloombox Design Labs and about my app that's launching, because I want to get people involved. I think for a long time, it's just been me leading a small team to try to have a high impact, but I think it's the time for us to grow and scale and to get more people involved on our team. So that's definitely part of it.
And who do you want to hear? Who do you hope hears not just this, but when you're doing these and trying to get this word out, who do you hope hears it?
Well, I love that educators will hear this one. I think they're the sort of the how do I put it? All of the future of our planet depends on the kids they're raising. So I think that's really lucky if they lend an ear to this. But I hope people from all different spheres hear it, whether that's design and architecture, or education, or energy, or on the investment side, or social justice side, and women's rights activists. I don't mind. I want to create a global community that's putting design thinking at the heart of solving big problems.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, before I let you go, where should folks find you? What are the links and all the things that folks? You said you're not on TikTok, but any others? Actually, you're on Twitter. I don't think you're probably on there very much, but I think I tagged you the other day. But share those links.
I will do that for sure. Bloomboxdesignlabs.com, BLOOMBOX designlabs.com. I have Instagram, Sofie Roux, SOFIE.ROUX, as well as Sparkly and Smart, which is for all things Bloombox and Super Bloom and Sparkly and Smart related. Thank you very much for your time. It was really an honor to be here.
Well, thank you.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.